So today's question is, does God cause natural disasters? We have a good sheet here. I won't read all of it, but we have to kind of think about this question because those who believe in a living and active God, we have to think about how might God be involved in these natural disasters because they happen. Whether our human activities play a role in it, whether we think kind of God causes it, we need to have these questions. Even for those properly reserved in making theological claims about environmental events, these questions have importance, not least because many biblical texts link divine judgment with natural catastrophe. Think of the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, the plagues in Egypt, prophetic word of impending doom. With each of these texts cites sinful human behavior for what happens in the ecosystem, God is certainly portrayed as involved. Indeed, doesn't God make matters worse sometimes? For all the talk about God's commitment to the stewardship of the earth, in these stories we find God contributing to environmental degradation. Some interpreters of the current world scene do not hesitate to claim a link between divine judgment and such disasters. They point to the depletion of the ozone layer, global warming, unnatural development in the animal world like deformed frogs, the spread of deadly disease, weather patterns that seem uncommonly violent, and they name them as a judgment of God. But often they only do that when someone else is affected. A few years ago, there was a pastor in Texas who made claims about all the flooding in New Orleans as divine judgment for some of the political decisions they made, the lifestyles of people living there. Then, like a year later, there was a flood in his town, and his home got wiped away. He was very quiet. That's how it goes sometimes. Aside from the heightened rhetoric and undisciplined certainty that often accompany such claims, is there a kernel of truth in the linkage of such phenomenon to God's judgmental activity? Even those who don't draw such conclusions and recognize our inadequate knowledge of natural history and the difficulties of comparing disasters with one another have often been given to a nagging bewilderment regarding such events. What are we to make of all the natural disasters that make up a regular part of our world? Do we name them all in terms of the judgment of God, in whole, in part, or just sometimes? If so, how do we know when and when not to? All these considerations beg the question of what it means to speak of the judgment of God, which will be in another lesson, but not right now. I can't put all that in 11 minutes. So from another angle, one is given to wonder about the nature of God's good creation. Can good include natural disasters? And we did talk about that last week, so when we talked about did God create the world good but not perfect. A lot of these disasters, as we call them, have been happening long before humans ever came onto the scene. The world, as we know, was formed through what we would consider now a natural disaster. Remember the whole one continent Earth and how it shifted apart? Do we have oceans and things now? That was probably pretty disastrous at the time. The mountains being formed, Hawaii being formed. Some of our favorite places are caused through what we would consider natural disasters. Often, we center human experience and define everything in relation to how it affects us or me without a bigger picture. So tornadoes have always been the case. Wildfires, forest fires, these things can be good for nature. They sometimes can be bad for us. Some wildfires happen naturally, and they can be a good thing. Even if they burn down homes, they're good for the environment. So who gets to make the claim what is good, what is bad, what is a disaster? We've had rising floods and lower. It used to be certain areas of our country were underwater. There was a great sea that divided our continent. Then it goes down, flooding. All these things changes create the world. So they're all part of a natural system of things. We sometimes assume they're disastrous because of how it affects us in our short term. We're not always looking at the long term. Sometimes the big catastrophic changes are actually good for the long-term earth. It changes the soil structure, because if you have the same crops over and over again in the same land, it's going to go bad. Sometimes we need changing. When oceans rise too high, then recede again, it leaves behind all kinds of biological stuff that then feed the soil. So if you're looking at a 100 million year scale, rising seawater levels could be a good thing. And they go back down again. Glaciers coming. The people at the time probably didn't like the Ice Age and glaciers coming at them. Now we like them because they created all the lakes we have and the valleys and all this stuff. So how do you define disasters as good or bad? Plays a role in what you see as God's role in all of this as well. So, some sense, such potentially destructive natural events are God designed in the very creation of things. We wouldn't have the world without these God-created, designed movements of the earth. The spinning of the planet is pretty important for everything that happens here, but that can also cause hurricanes and things. The weather patterns that bring us rain for the crops, great. Sometimes those are more severe, cause tornadoes, but it's all part of the system. In today's world, a clear distinction must be made between moral order events, such as 9/11, and cosmic order events, such as hurricanes, but not an absolute distinction. The question needs to be asked, given the interrelated spiderweb of the world we inhabit, has not human sin had an adverse effect on only some natural events? Because everything we do affects the natural world. Everything. How much shower water you use, how much gas you use, whether you mow your lawn high or short, whether you put pesticides on your lawn, whether you have flowers on it, whether you cut down the tree, how much you drive, how much you fly, everything has an effect on everything else. It's the spider web. You hit one little piece and it can shake over there. So we do have a role in everything that's happening in our environment. How much, we may never know. What causes climate change? Are we to blame for a lot of the climate changes, or is it part of a larger cycle? You have to at least say we've caused some problems because there's a lot of plastic in the ocean, and that kills sea creatures. We've decimated and wiped out all kinds of different creatures. There's always extinctions. What's really interesting is Siri. If you look at the hundreds of years where before Europeans came to America, there was like maybe one extinction of an animal. After they came, hundreds upon hundreds. We have a role to play in how we manage the land, how we use the soil, how we treat the animals. All of that plays a part in these disasters too. Mudslides can happen if we take out too many trees and there's no roots to keep it in. The Dust Bowl happened largely because of things we did as a people, and it was considered a major disaster. So all that plays a role. But we can't fully let God off the hook either. This is the case from at least two perspectives. On the one hand, such natural disasters constitute an integral part of God's creational design. And on the other hand, specific natural events may be made more severe by human sin, in connection with which one might indeed must speak of a divine judgment. Again, that judgment may be considered a natural consequence and not I'm going to send a tornado to destroy your house because you stole cable. In either case, God cannot be entirely removed from some kind of complicity with natural disasters. So it's not that God just I'm going to send a hurricane to this town because I didn't like the way they had church last Sunday or something like that. A lot of judgment is often natural consequences. You do this, this naturally results. If you play with fire, you get burned. It's not that God's like, well, you were playing with fire, I'm going to have you burnt now. It's natural consequences. If you eat way too much popcorn at night, you may get a stomach ache. Is that God's judgment on you? It's part of the system, but you brought it upon yourself. The sins that we do often have natural consequences. They're all part of life. So God has a role in the natural world, but it's not so much God just picking and choosing and sending all these things. You have a bit of that in the Bible as they're trying to explain, but you see less of that as you go because they're growing in their understanding of how God is at work. Just like how you might have heard thunder was the angels bowling when you were a little kid. You probably don't believe that anymore. They were trying to understand the natural world and God's role in it, and so for a while it's God's causing it all the time and not God creates a system that then's able to work and function and grow, which I find particularly amazing of creation, that we have this system that contains itself, that works, that keeps bringing the rain and the wind and the changing seasons. That to me is a lot more impressive of a God who create that and let it go than having to constantly pull all the levers all the time, that creational design. Questions, comments, snide remarks? All right, I will see you next week. Have a good weekend, good Mother's Day.